Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast and another new thing. Technical term there. We're starting as we mean to go on. We're going to do an audible history of the peninsula. I have been discussing with my guest today about the need for a written history of the Peninsular War. We're game for that. Watch this space. It'll probably take us the next 2 decades to actually make it a reality because we're both so busy, but that's beside the point. In the meantime, you'll have to make do with a history of the Peninsular War in your ears. I'm not going to lie, people have wanted this for a heck of a long time. Pretty much when I started this, somebody turned around to me and said, well, you could have just done a history of the Peninsular War as a podcast. I was like, yeah, but I want to do other stuff. And I had it on the back burner as something to do, and I just never got round to it until today. But rather than me just sit here and drone at you for the next 90 odd minutes on the history of the Peninsular War, which, let's be honest, you'd get bored of, you'd stop listening to, I thought, why don't we get somebody brilliant and have a kind of back and forth? So I'm not hogging the mic with this, but I'm kind of co-hosting, co-presenting, cohabiting, perhaps not quite cohabiting, with my very dear friend, the master of adventures in Historyland, author of Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, all-round great individual, the Count Lando that is Josh Provan. Josh, it is very good to see you, my liege. How goeth the day? Sorry, I don't know why I've gone all like Shakespeare on you there, but we'll go with it. How are things? How goeth the day?
The day goeth well, Sir Zachary. General White, I believe, was the title. Yes, this is bringing up the heady days of Napoleon Total War gaming during the 2020-2021 period in our shared history, where fittingly, my favorite army to fight with was the Spanish, and I got very attached to a sort of alter ego I created for myself called Count Lando. But it goes well.
The devs were heavily against you on that, I have to say. Sorry,
Oh, they
so
were.
for people who aren't gaming nerds, devs, developers, people who put together games, they stacked the cards horrifically heavily, as we discussed in a previous episode, in fact, video episodes indeed.
Uh-huh.
The bias was the French was monumental
Yes.
on that one. That just the way that they'd coded it, the Imperial Guard just had the ability to wipe the floor with anything. You could charge them with the best cavalry units in the game whilst they're in line, and they still wouldn't rout. That's the kind of insanely OP, overpowered stuff we're talking about. We've gone a long way from the history of the Peninsular War. We will get back to that in just a moment.
Yes.
But yes, based on that experience, I can safely say, as we laboured that Shakespearean episode even more, that there is nobody I would rather storm Cawdor Castle with. So it is fantastic to have you on. Yeah, we're going to have a back and forth about this. Both of us just kind of bringing our knowledge to the table, and perhaps slightly predictably, but also very logically, we're going to start at the beginning. Well, we're going to start before the fighting even happens. And I think we'll get to some fighting today, folks. Don't worry. Bailen is incoming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fascinating one in and of itself. But we need to talk about where this comes from in order to then go to town on the events itself. And I think there is that temptation to just skip to late 1808, Wellington landing at Mondego Bay, relief of Amiro, and then let's leapfrog to, 1809, Coruña, John Moore, and then from there leapfrog to Talavera, Porto and Talavera. We're not going to do it that way. We are going to do this carefully, methodically, and we're going to also try and do this sort of transnationally. That's not me being kind of hipster about the whole thing. It's just that this is not a war of Britain versus France fought at some kind of away arena that is Spain and Portugal, to use a horrific footballing analogy. This is a conflict that fundamentally is about Spanish and Portuguese efforts to be independent of French control, about a kind of snowballing of French involvement in the area, particularly initially, and then struggling to find any reasonable solution to the fact that they're very heavily invested in Spain. So we're going to look at this from a multinational perspective. We will look at British, Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, possibly even Polish perspectives, actually, because some Polish troops do wind up in Spain. So we're going to do what I'm trying to say in a horrifically long-winded fashion is we're doing it properly. So let's make a start. Where does all of this start? We were having a bit of a chuckle before we started, in that inevitably we're going to talk about the continental system, right? There, I do like a Game of Thrones analogy. That is a well-known thing, and I was trying to come up with one that wasn't too tortuous. For me, I kind of feel like the whole Iberian Peninsula thing that Napoleon does is a little bit like Joffrey at the end of the first season of Game of Thrones, where he's got everything laid out in front of him, and then he just decides to go and really hack off a major ally. Well, major's exaggerating it, but a significant ally, by going and executing Ned Stark. Spoiler alert, a very sincere apologies if you hadn't seen that one coming. But let's be honest, they cast Sean Bean in the role, so of course he was going to die. And it's a little bit like that. Joffrey doesn't need to hack off the North, but proceeds to go and do precisely that and start a rebellion in the process, in his backyard. And there's kind of an element of that with Napoleon and the continental system. So we're looking sort of 1805, 6, 7 here, right? So 1805, you've got the crushing victory at Austerlitz. Russia and Austria utterly humiliated. The Third Coalition left in tatters. Then 1806, of course, the Prussians come into the game far too late. Should have come in 1805, but didn't for a whole multitude of reasons we don't have the time to look into now. Fourth Coalition, that goes horrifically, a la Jena Auerstadt. And then we wind up at Tilsit. See, for me, this one is quite a kind of an odd situation. You made this point brilliantly at the start, Josh, that post Tilsit, all Napoleon's really got to do is make people hate the British. And this is not a particularly tricky thing at this moment in time.
Absolutely not. I mean, after Tilsit, and I mean, fair play to the Allies. The Russians gave a good go at Eylau, but they just lost the plot completely at Friedland and delivered unto Napoleon another one of his least known decisive victory at Friedland, pretty much. And then you get Tilsit, where Alexander and Napoleon get really, buddy, and like the first. I mean, just to hammer that point home about how all he has to do is make people hate the British. The first thing the Tsar says to him when he gets on that stupid barge is like, sire, I hate the British as much as you do. And Napoleon's like, well, the conversation's like half over then, isn't it? And that is he had one job, and that was, and he knew it. The entire idea of the continental system, this dreamed up, this sort of massive idea of dreaming up a way to basically a new economic policy for the entire bulk of coastal Europe, is its main job is just to strangle the British out of the war, or at least to get them to a treaty table where he can, as usual, dominate a settlement. But he goes about this in the most sort of unnecessarily aggravating manner that does as much damage to what should have been his allies, but he really sees more of as his vassals and dependents, than it needs to. And it is one of his. It is his ultimate downfall, really. This system.
It really is. On many occasions, I have kind of prodded fun at Napoleon. Here's a guy whose ego and actual power because he does have the power to do this, means that he could and therefore did dictate the economic policy of the entire continent. Now, he had the ability to do that, but I think the key there is dictate.
Hmm.
Whether there was the need to dictate it in quite the same way is an open question. The method that he used is certainly one of the more draconian means designed to instill greater compliance. But there is an important thing that perhaps in the past I haven't really acknowledged, which is, I mean, sum it up in 3 words: orders in council. The British are by no means angels. In fact, you could argue that Napoleon is learning this from the Brits, because we're trying to do exactly the same thing. We're trying to stop everybody from trading with the French with varying degrees of success. And we're not doing it in a pleasant way either. Go and see the episodes that we've done on things like impressment and the War of 1812, and the way in which that seriously hacks off other nations.
Look at Denmark, for heaven's sake. I mean, the British were legitimately worried about the continental system, and the fact that we happened to manage to create coalitions and sort of dictate counter-economic policies better than Napoleon is beside the point. But look at the whole ridiculous course of events that led to the British going to Denmark and, just sort of battering the hell out of the Danish Navy is literally, while the Danish weren't looking, I might add, this was completely an underhanded sucker punch to make sure that the Danes didn't join Napoleon, and in so doing, ham-fistedly ensured they would join Napoleon. Shows that not only do the British make mistakes in what they're doing, but also that they are being utterly just uncompromising about how they were going to prosecute the war, just as much as Napoleon is, to be honest.
And perhaps we need to we do need to do a separate episode on Copenhagen,
Mm.
but we won't go into that now. I do wonder though, is there fear there? Look, we won Trafalgar. There's a bunch of ships. I kind of question, is the Navy side of things an excuse, or is it actual abject fear that, look, we won Trafalgar, we can't afford to risk another one, because what if it goes wrong? And so, look, I'm very sorry, Denmark, but your ships, we're having them, kind of thing. It feels like an emergency measure. And that's not to say that the British are, as we're emphasizing heavily, angels in this story at any point. However, and we're going to kind of look at later on at how the British aren't, sort of the avenging angel in this story of the Peninsular War either. So we love to do this narrative of in sweep the British, serving up support for libertarian ideals. And sorry, no, just see what we don't do when it comes to Portugal. But this feels ever so slightly excessively out of character for the British. There's an overly heavy-handedness to this one, to Copenhagen, that just does seem a bit kind of, oh crap, we better do something about this.
Yeah, the British definitely basically got the willies about this idea of a maritime power with an effective fleet doing whatever it wanted, having its own autonomy to choose its allies, essentially, even though they were much more likely at that time to choose the British on just outright neutrality than the French, because the Danish literally had no reason to join either side. The whole thing, which somebody should absolutely do something on the Baltic theatre, because that is of critical importance in the Napoleonic Wars. The fact it all ties into the League of Armed Neutrality that the Danish were theoretically part of, which disintegrated when Tsar Paul was assassinated, and therefore left it vulnerable. But up to that point, the British had been very angry about the sort of armed convoys that the Danish were running into the Baltic, and the whole idea of the Baltic trade being secured was a massive reason why the British said, well, we have to make sure we can still get our pitch and tar out through the Baltic to keep the fleet in the water. So the easiest way to do that is essentially just to take away the only other active fleet in that area and replace it with ours. So that's what they did.
Yeah. I think we've made the point, Brits, not angels. And
Yeah.
it should be quite easy to get people together and go,
Yes.
you know what, the Brits, we don't like them, do we?
Mhm.
So why don't we just not buy their stuff? Um, as a as a policy, it doesn't really work in the longer term. There is debate about to what extent does this whole thing do more harm to France and French
Mm.
economic interests than anyone else. And I imagine Alex Mickenbird is looking into exactly that question as we speak. But I guess the thing to kind of focus on here is how do we get from that to the Peninsular War? And one of the nations, as some folks will be familiar with, that is ordered to comply is, surprise, surprise, Portugal. Bearing in mind that at this point, Spain is an ally, so there are no issues there. We're going to get to the whole Spanish thing, but the Spanish aren't. Well, there's rumblings of discontent. It's fair to say that the Spanish are a reluctant ally at this moment in time, but nonetheless, they are an ally. It's Portugal that's the starting point here. It's an independent nation. It's largely stayed out of the conflict. It's not, let's be honest, and I'm very sorry to Portuguese listeners, but it's not deemed a threat to Napoleon's interests or anyone's interests, really. It does have a long-standing association with Britain, a la, Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II. We often talk about it being the longest alliance that Britain has enjoyed. That goes all the way back to the 1300s. So there's this long-standing connection there. There's a significant expat community as well, particularly in the Douro River Valley region. But as I say, nobody's really kind of looking at Portugal and going, there's a threat that we all need to worry about. I guess it's an interesting one in terms of Portugal and where they're at in 1807. We should probably say a little bit more about the nature of the country at this point in time. But also, there's just a kernel of inclination to go, maybe we won't. We'll get to what actually happens in a minute, but the initial response when the envoys pitch up isn't, okay, how high do you want us to jump? There is this kind of thing of, well, maybe we won't.
Mm. Yeah, as far as I know, and I must admit that I am a lot stronger on Spanish affairs than Portuguese affairs at this time, but famously the Portuguese were very cagey and very crafty about this. They were very well aware that first of all, on their doorstep, they had the Spanish. The Spanish and the Portuguese are not friends by any means, and there's a lot of enmity there. And the Portuguese are very well aware that the Spanish are basically just waiting for an opportunity to, march across the border and either institute a change of government in which the Spanish are in control. This has happened before. So they have that to worry about. As you're saying, they are also well aware that the Spanish are allies of the French, and that's a worry for them, because Portugal is isolated. It's not massively wealthy anymore. It's no longer a super colonial power. It does have excellent trading links, though, still into the east, and of course to Brazil, which is the major colonial asset. And as far as I'm aware, the Portuguese, first of all, do the sensible thing. They don't tell Napoleon to go and stuff himself. They say, "Oh well, yes, of course, master of Europe, that is an excellent plan. We're going to work on that." And then, once they go out to have tea, they go into the next room and say, "Hey, Britain, hey, we have a problem here. Any chance of a handout?" And then the British, being the British in 1807, basically say, "I don't think we can help, actually." because there's no opening. And this is the thing you were talking about before. The British response to the Portuguese crisis is actually to sort of wring their hands a little bit and say, well, there's not really very much we can do, is there, chaps? I mean, maybe we could send a fleet to Lisbon, maybe?
There is a caricature to be made. It's sort of, oh, I'm terribly sorry, old boy, but it's an awfully unfortunate state of affairs. But really, I mean, there's very little. Our fleet's tied up. We're thinking of sending it to South America. So really, it's really not a lot we can do. Apologies that wasn't attempted to.
That was excellently done. That was excellently done, and it was absolutely the case that the British were because as well, that whole fiasco in the Baltic. The British are not doing well at this time. We're not getting any headway apart from the major fleet actions. And they're getting so desperate, they're thinking of sending thousands of men to South America to stir up trouble against the Spanish Empire halfway across the world, because it worked so well before to do that. And they were thinking of sending a chap called Arthur Wellesley, who was a bit of a buzz in India from India. He's fought in hot places before. He'll probably know what he's doing. So they want to send a force to India, and they are also contemplating actually getting involved further still in the Baltic in Sweden at this time. So they're not really interested in helping Portugal out. They have no thought that this could be where they can win the war.
No, it's really not. I think that's partly sort of you take one look at the Portuguese army at this moment in time and you just go, sorry, but no. And I think Napoleon knows that as well. Even notwithstanding the sort of the Grande Armée kind of mentality. Okay, so by this point he hasn't got his army of Austerlitz with him. That's fragmented and it's been broken over the course of the subsequent 2 years. But the scale of the demands is really telling in terms of Napoleon's confidence that he has the power here, and there's very little the Portuguese can do, because it's not just economic policy, it's also foreign policy. He insists that you close your ports to British trade. Okay, that's just standard continental system. Confiscate all British goods. So really go and hack off the Brits here. Then on top of that, arrest all British subjects in your territory. Interesting legal question to be considered there, but we'll put that to one side. Join its fleets with the French, and then top it all off, declare war on Britain. So it's not even a suggestion of, look, I don't like you trading with the British. I don't want you trading with the British. Stop the whole British thing, and then I'll leave you be. It's, you're going to declare war. You're going to do my foreign policy. That it's my way or the highway kind of thing. And as you say, the Brits know all about this, and they just don't do very much about it. I'm sorry to my British listeners. You might make up 40% of the listener base here, but we're just not very responsive when it comes to the Portuguese, because the strategic kind of outlook doesn't scream, okay, yes, let's send an army into Portugal.
There is no strategic impetus there. The oldest trading alliance is nice and useful and things like that in peacetime and whatnot, but it means very little to the British during this part of the Napoleonic Wars. I believe we actually had an episode last year or something, possibly, where you put to a bunch of your guests, and I was one of them, how would you rank the importance of various theatres for the British? And the Iberian Peninsula is rock bottom on everybody's list, and it really was, because except for Gibraltar, which is the Mediterranean strategic sphere, and that is, it doesn't have any, the British don't care. The Mediterranean is the important thing in the southern Europe for the British. The Atlantic is completely covered by the Navy as far as they're concerned. They don't really see the profit in getting involved in defending Portugal for some reason against the Spanish and the French. And from Napoleon's point of view, this is part of his sort of trying to pull strings, and because he does use a little carrot and stick in this way, right? So he's trying to hit the Portuguese with a stick, right? But he's trying to hand the Spanish a carrot. He's saying to the Spanish, because he's going to make this work by basically saying to the Spanish that I'll let you run Portugal once he figures out that the Portuguese are not going to play ball. I'm going to just let you mess around with Portugal, and then everyone will be happy. He's doing the same thing with the Russians. Part of the Treaty of Tilsit was basically that they were going to be able to invade Finland, which is a possession of the Swedes at this time. And that's what's going on there. The Tsar is quite merrily gathering an army together to go and invade Finland and knock the Swedish out of the war, because the Swedish and the Portuguese are at the second the only two nations in Europe not playing the game of the continental system.
Yeah, I mean, Napoleon's plan, and he comes up with this plan in October 1807, is that it's signed at Fontainebleau, as you might imagine, between France and Spain. It's basically, yep, we'll invade, basically the French doing the heavy lifting in that invasion, as you perhaps might expect.
It's like one
and then
army from the Spaniards or something like that is supposed to rock up under either Castaños or I don't know, one of the other ones. One of the older generals.
Yeah, there are a few to choose from, let's be honest, when it comes to the Spanish army. And yeah, like I say, it's going to be split three ways. So you kind of have the sort of southern, eastern section, what is effectively Alentejo, probably ruined the pronunciation there, and the Algarve, that goes to Godoy as his kind of like little personal kind of mini kingdom thing.
Manuel Godoy is someone we'll get to talk about in a minute, I'm sure.
Oh yes, oh yes. And then you've got kind of the northern part, which is going to go to the King of Etruria, Italian kind of kingdom region, and then sort of the central bit ends up being under military rule. That's basically the plan here.
So it's basically downright partition of Portugal. He's going to treat it like Poland.
He's going to dismember the thing. It's as simple as that. That's once it's apparent that the Portuguese aren't going to say yes, okay then. Before we get onto the fact that the Portuguese do then say yes, okay then, which is another.
Oh, they absolutely do. Yeah.
This is another important point. They do give in to the demands in the end. We should just talk a little bit about Portuguese society by this point. A little bit kind of difficult for those who draw heavily on the English sources at this point in time, because when the Brits rock up in particularly 1810, there is basically this mass outpouring of, God, isn't Lisbon awful? There's this utter disdain of, there's filth in the streets, they're chucking their effluents out everywhere into the gutters, everybody's got lice, nobody washes, they're all Catholics. Worst of all, Lord save us, we're in the country of the Catholics and they're all ruled by their priests who are dirty and lateral. I'm quoting directly what I'm paraphrasing, but drawing on snippets directly from what you've basically got is mass xenophobia. And you pointed this out before we started recording, whilst we were just chatting. This is partly a Protestant Catholic problem, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. There is something in I suppose it's culture and historiography that the Spanish call the Black Legend, and that is on the one hand, this thing is often too much relied upon by apologists of things that, say, the Spanish or any Catholic country did that is unpalatable to sort of more liberal modern tastes. And at the same time, it does have actual legitimate kernels of truth to it. Because, for instance, the most famous one is the Spanish Inquisition. It's now known, actually, that it's quite specific how many people were actually tortured and executed by the Spanish Inquisition, and is nowhere near what was once thought of, because the Protestants were the ones who were reporting that. Then you have things like the conquest of the Indies, which is, of course, its own massive subject and deeply morally reprehensible in many ways. Again, though, the Protestant writers and people in northern and far eastern Europe and things loved to go far above and beyond, talking about that, and then of course just the state of Portugal and Spain. Like you're saying, this whole thing about them being ruled by their priests, they're all backwards, medieval minded, dirty peasants, essentially, is basically the consensus. If you look at the Grand Tour, for instance, the place where people send their the nobility and aristocracy send their people, children, to be educated. Send their people. I don't know what that means. Their
Well,
staff.
children are technically people.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. It sort of gives the impression that it's sort of like a staff holiday, there, doesn't it? If you say, "I'm going to send my people on this
I'm going to send
trip,"
my staff on a little holiday,
yeah,
gap
indeed,
to Rome or
yes,
something.
indeed. But exactly, it's places like Rome and Venice and Austria, Germany, France. St. Petersburg is starting to make it onto that list. So but people just sort of thought that was for laughs because they thought it was like a good imitation of France, and the and places like that, like places like the Ottoman Empire and Egypt were more popular destinations for people to send their kids to finish their education than Spain and Portugal. And I think it's for this sort of reason, a massive prejudice. And it has to be said, it goes both ways. The Catholics were not, were not exactly the biggest fans of the English Protestants either. So basically, whenever you hear or read a British person talking about certain things, it's always best to try and dig a little deeper to see whether that can actually be substantiated, because sometimes it's just prejudice.
Yeah, the Brits are very good at xenophobia during this period. It has to be said. There, and as you've alluded to it, there's more respect for the French than there is for
Oh,
their Spanish and
yes.
Portuguese allies, and that's abundantly clear. And go see previous episodes from the very early days of this show talking about exactly that problem. What I find quite canny from the Portuguese in terms of how they try and handle this, though, is they try and bribe Napoleon's people, and this you've just got to love that. His officials and advisors are invited to take money to sort of make this problem go away. And Portugal isn't a hugely rich country at this moment in time. Yes, okay, people point to the colony of Brazil and go, well, there's wealth. To give you a measure of that, the Portuguese have an earthquake in the sort of mid period of in Lisbon in the sort of middle of the 18th century. And when the Brits rock up in 1810, they're looking at this place going, what's happened to it? It's been leveled. Why haven't they rebuilt it? Was this recent? And they can't kind of understand that there isn't the money for the public works to put this city back together. So there is sort of serious consideration given to what options have we got, and well, look, if we can buy some people off, then do it, because militarily there isn't a solution to this problem.
Yeah, the entire Iberian Peninsula is in a very rocky financial state at this time. It has to be said. As I said before, although they do have rich colonies or colonies that can be rich, the wealth for some reason is not really transferring itself very well, and they're in absolute decline. I mean, the Portuguese were one of the first sort of big trading nations, and they flourished greatly up until the 18th century, much like the Spanish did, to be honest. But as is quite often the case, you get a economic downturn and then a natural disaster, and then an aggressive neighbor likes to take advantage of that. And it's not the Portuguese is in the Portuguese are in no position to resist the French in any way, but to basically delay them and pray that they can kind of sort of survive in some state or another. Their monarchy is in a mess as well. I believe one of their either the king or the heir died of smallpox, and they're currently under a regent because his mother, who should be ruling, is mentally ill. And so you have troubles in the government as well. It should be easy pickings, really, to be absorbed into the continental system, to be honest.
I mean, actually, it is easy pickings, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Let's kind of make that plain
true.
that it's not Portugal that's the problem here. That
No,
ends up being Spain. Although the invasion is a bit of a farce, it has to be said. You know,
yes.
they sure. So Juno's given the army. Apologies, I forget off the top of my head what that force was, but I want to say something in the region of 8 to 10,000. Um, they're sent on a forced march. Look, get to Lisbon ASAP. And there's a very simple reason for that. Napoleon's not thick. And he's looked at this situation and gone, what would I do if I was the Portuguese government and I had this nice, safe colony on the other side of the Atlantic that I can't be caught at because there's a thing called the Royal Navy.
Mm,
What would I do? I would pack everything up, including my treasury, and I would leg it where you can't get me, and I would thumb my nose at you. Um, and surprise, surprise, that's precisely what the Portuguese royal family do. And there are stories, carts desperately galloping down the city streets to reach the port to get everybody out.
mm.
So the French are told to get a move on, get to Lisbon, get the treasury. We need the money. They don't actually succeed. By the
No.
time Juno marches through the gates, he's down to 1,500 men. Some units are down to like 10% strength.
Yes.
So
I
it's
mean, we should. Yeah, that is in itself the a symptom of how bad that campaign was planned and administered. The people in the French army that crossed into Portugal and legged it to Lisbon described the advance as if it was a retreat. The privations were as if it was a retreat. They had to go through a section of Portugal that was, didn't have the best roads, didn't had a fairly hostile population. They didn't have good supplies through the mountains. And by the time they got to the low ground and the road to Lisbon, Juno had to select 1,500 of the best remaining men, the ones who had weapons and clothes, basically, and rush them to Lisbon, and who could walk. uh, and those are the guys that enter Lisbon, in triumph. Except, of course, the place has been stripped clean, and the regent and his family have all legged it to Brazil. That being said, as we did allude to before, they did at the very last minute, as is bearing down on them, basically say, right, we'll declare war on England. Either I'm going to arrest every English person in Lisbon, which they did do. They did all that stuff, but it was too late. And Juno was going to go and do his job. I mean, he occupied Lisbon.
I mean, he did. I mean, he did just about in time to just sort of wave goodbye
Mm,
to the the royal fleet as it sets sail. As they're literally all they can do is stand and watch from the hills.
mm.
That's how kind of close they get. So he does his best, although as we're saying, very fast. I think some of them, according to some accounts, were too weak to hold their muskets
I think so.
in the
Yeah,
victory parade.
it was really bad.
It was absolutely horrific. But it does mean that that should be it, right? Portugal, okay, yes, you can say hostile, perhaps scope for resistance, but there isn't this kind of instantaneous, massive guerrilla campaign a la what we see in Spain for reasons
No,
that we'll get to in
no,
due course.
because indeed, how did Juno get to Portugal, for instance? There's a large country, surely, between France and Portugal. Yeah, this raises a question or two, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And it brings us on very neatly to Spain, the other problem, which at this point is not a thorn in the side. It is a reluctant ally. We can't deny that. The The important thing I think to acknowledge here is the 1806 question, as I call it, this inclination, this question mark of whether or not the Spanish were inclined, and the answer is yes, they were, to declare war on Napoleon as part of the War of the Fourth Coalition. And then Jena, Auerstadt happens, and they go, yeah, no, that's not a smart move. It's worth us just exploring why there is that discontent within
Yeah,
within
definitely.
Spain at that alliance before we kind of look at the morality on both sides
Hmm.
of this decision to declare war. Well, not even declare war, just de facto replace your monarchy because you're mine now. Um, See, when I think about the sort of the 1806 situation, I do have this kind of sense of it being almost Zimmerman telegram-esque. For folks who aren't familiar, the Zimmerman telegram was a significant factor in causing the USA to join World War One on the side of the Allied nations, um, because basically one of the members of the Prussian German imperial government, apologies, got to get my history correct there, had been encouraged, I think it was the foreign minister actually, had been encouraging Mexico to invade the USA. And this message got leaked. And the USA kind of went,
if there's one good way to tick off the United States is to try and get Mexico to invade.
I mean, the history there is not a pleasant one.
How dare you? How dare you try and rile up the Mexicans?
So it does have that air of, because realistically, had Mexico invaded at that moment in time, they would have got hammered.
I'm not even sure Mexico would have been able to have. There was a massive civil war happening. I'm not really sure what's.
I've never seen Josh so perplexed as he is at this moment in time.
The Germans were really reaching for that. I mean, wow.
But the nature of the Spanish army, such as we know it to be because of the Peninsular War, does make you question quite what anybody was realistically thinking would happen. Now, on the Spanish side, let's bear in mind that this is the same Spanish army that in 1808 is realistically planning offences across the River Ebro to take on French forces that have pulled back in the wake of events that we're going to discuss in just a moment. So there's confidence there, even if aspiration outstrips reality.
There definitely is, yeah.
But Spain, let's get to Spain as a whole. As a country, I would say it depends which region you're in. Actually, Galicia, not a particularly wealthy region. Andalusia, more so, more wealthy. It very much depended on where you were, the city you were in as well, I think. But I'm not one of these people who likes to argue that, well, the Spanish had it coming anyway because they were backward and all the rest of it. It is worth acknowledging that Spain's heydays are far, far in the rearview mirror. Yes, Spain might have colonies overseas. Britain's looking at those thinking, oh, they're terribly shiny and oh, they're rich for, brewing up dissent and all the rest of it. But I mean, it's weak militarily. We know that. I do question what Napoleon's plan is, though, when it comes to this. Is the idea, hey, let's take the navy and then use that to either replace losses, or there is also talk about a campaign for Constantinople. So Napoleon's one of these people with many ideas, and some of them come to fruition and some of them don't. Others question, is it a stepping stone to Gibraltar and then North Africa? So there's all sorts of reasons, but either way, ultimately, Napoleon has the advantage here because he's able to move troops in, because he can go, look, guys, Portugal, I need to have this line of supply and communication. I also need to replace troops garrisoned in Portugal and all the rest.
I'm going to cut you in on the deal as well.
Yeah, exactly.
For your trouble.
And it does have that sort of dodgy dealings aspect to it. But he signed a treaty, right? This has been agreed between the Spanish and the French that yes, we'll split it up three ways. And he's got Portugal at his disposal. I've rambled a lot there and waffled and hogged the mic. Talk me through, you're better on Spain than I am during this period and its kind of internal machinations. We also need to talk about Godoy in amongst everything else.
Yes.
So hit me with your thoughts.
Well, here's what I'm thinking. The whole idea of the Spanish sort of jumping in on the bandwagon of, battering the French over the head in 1806 is absolutely a symptom of the way the war has gone for Spain since 1800. Now, Manuel Godoy is the brainchild of this plan. He is not the most reliable ally for Napoleon, and Godoy is, and probably, and quite rightly, a chap who is going to try and put Spain first. And at this point, they are in dire debt. Their fleet is out of action and will not be able really to defend the coasts effectively. They are mired in political intrigue, and they are, culturally and civically, they're kind of already factionalized between forces of reform and forces of conservatism. And Godoy feels that the 1806 coalition, the war in Germany, is Spain's opportunity to rid themselves of this stupid French alliance, the Treaty of Ildefonso, I believe it is, at last. And, we can get back onto where we were before, but we can get some traction out of this, because this alliance is just dragging us into utter debt and destruction. And it's a way. It's not the answer to all Spain's problems, but he sees it as something that, one of those things that politicians do, where they say, this is one thing I can do, and if I do this, then I'm the shining star. So there's that. That's where Godoy decides he's going to try and unfortunately Napoleon wins big against the Prussians, and so Godoy has to sort of dying inside applaud his ally for winning, and he's not getting out of that treaty now. But then and so he's actually quite happy to go along with Napoleon's idea at Fontainebleau to partition Portugal, because, well, we get a chunk of that. Napoleon's probably going to give us money as well, and all good. Yay, wonderful. But the problem is Napoleon is very aware that the King of Spain is a Bourbon. That is a big problem. In fact, such a problem, and such an obvious something that everybody knew in Paris and Napoleon's government, that Marshal Bessier, who was a good friend of Napoleon, is quoted as saying, as long as Napoleon is in power, no throne in Europe can be occupied by a Bourbon. Napoleon's second big downfall is his driving vendetta to remove the Bourbon family from the thrones of Europe. It gets him into trouble in Italy, and it gets him into trouble in Spain. And because of those internal problems that I alluded to before, in 1807, there was discovered a palace coup called the Escorial coup, or plot. The idea was to try and get, I think his title was the Prince of Asturias at the time, Fernando, the heir to the throne, to become either king or regent for his father, Charles IV, Carlos IV. And that had been discovered, and obviously, Fernando was in now deep trouble, and his party was also now, out in the open as, a danger to the state. Napoleon got wind of this, and he thought, oh, another Bourbon throne is having a crisis. Oh, that's interesting. Let's look at this closer, shall we? And he sees in this the opportunity as things progress, because then Godoy is unseated by the coup of Aranjuez, and because we should do an episode on Godoy, to be honest, because he's a very fascinating guy. He's reviled by a great amount of the nobility because he's apparently he's apparently the lover of the queen, and that's why he's in power. And he's supposedly you know and just messing around with all sorts of stuff and complicit in this, that, and the other, and everybody thinks he's a terrible guy. His story is ridiculous because he was just this really handsome guardsman who who the queen took a fancy to, and he ends up as the premier of Spain. But so we should do an episode of him at some point. But the fact of it is, Spain loses its way of governing itself, essentially, and the king and his son come at loggerheads eventually, is how it turns out, and up pops Napoleon. In fact, they ask Napoleon for, well, I believe this is after the invasion of Portugal. They ask Napoleon for mediation. By this
That's the
point,
big irony,
yeah,
right?
there's over 50,000 troops, French troops, in Spain at this point, all suspiciously gathered around major fortifications in Madrid. And Napoleon benignly invites both parties to Bayonne to discuss the matter.
It's fascinating. I see. I sometimes wonder if a smart play is missed by Napoleon when it comes to that revolt by the palace guards, Carlos for being forced to abdicate, because Ferdinand, number seven, is pro Napoleon, far more pro Napoleon, and quite anti Godoy, if my memory
Oh
serves
yes, he
me
hates Godoy.
correctly.
Yeah, because this is another thing we should briefly mention, is that the nobility, which more or less seem to be kind of on the side of Fernando. Some of them are split towards Godoy as well, because there was some reforming movements happening previous to that he was a part of, and that's another thing. But they are mostly Francophiles, and they're mocked for it by the bourgeois, who are proud Spaniards. And the peasantry don't really care, but they're Spanish. They're certainly Spanish. And they have been told by the clergy and their masters that the French are atheist devils. And indeed, the Spanish went to war with those same atheist devils in the 1790s. And that was what they were told. And they're not the peasantry aren't terribly keen on Godoy either, because some of the reforms he did messed with their ancient traditions, and they don't really like the aristocracy either, because they're all like, we should advance ourselves in Europe and get rid of all these superstitions and bullfighting and stuff like that are holding us back and making us laughing stock in the eyes of Europe. And the Spanish people are like, this is all we have to put our hats on, right? This is our identity you're dealing with here. Yeah, so all of Spain hates each other pretty much, and so it is essentially a powder keg in an arsenal that's about to go off, that Napoleon is about to drunkenly wander into with a lit match.
I love that analogy, but I kind of see it in a different way, which is that you sort of look at it and think, well, if you're careful, this is ripe for the picking.
Oh yes.
I mean, this sort of has, and apologies, I'm not usually a fan of sort of drawing cross comparisons across different periods of history, but you kind of touched on it yourself, sick man of Europe vibe, sort of Ottoman Empire riven by varying, okay, for different reasons, to what's happening in the Ottoman Empire, pre and during World War One, but nonetheless riven by discontent from a number of different groups. And there is the scope to divide and rule, but there's also this catastrophic misreading of the Spanish character. which is easy for us to look at, I have to say.
They don't like
Is
each other, but the majority of them really don't like the French either.
they don't, but also they're proud people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's easy for us to look at with the benefit of hindsight and everything that's happened over the subsequent 200 years and go, well, surely that was a dumb play. But it is one of those moments where Napoleon does seem to just misread the situation. And he's sure you won't hear me argue the fact that the Spanish intending to stab France in the back is not a pleasant
It's
power
daring.
play.
It's
It's
daring.
daring. It's
But
it's not clever. It's also exceptionally underhand. It's Napoleon-esque in its aspirations.
yeah, I mean, in
Um,
that sense, it could have paid off really well, but it didn't. So,
it didn't. But I mean, talk about holding a grudge,
mm,
right? 1806, Spain is thinking about this and then sort of looks at everything and goes, okay, no, clearly we've got to toe the line. And does,
mm.
let's emphasize that, the French troops are not hindered as they march in. You
This
can
is
question,
this is
well,
Godoy's lifeline. To be honest, he needs the French now. He can't fight them off. He's tried to reform the army. He's tried to get Spain into a position where it can fight, but he's just presented basically with this fact that Napoleon wants troops in Portugal. If he doesn't allow them to do that, he'll have to fight them, and he's not ready to. So,
yeah, there's no question about that. And then to cap it all off, you've got the way in which he summons them,
mm.
which is, look, the two of you had a falling out. We just need to sit down and sort this one
Yes.
out. Why don't you come to Bayonne? We'll sit around a table. I'll bring some nice wine and we'll sort this all out between you and we'll reach an amicable conclusion and we'll sort out this problem that you've got in Spain. And then says, oh, yeah, thanks for coming, guys. Neither of you are monarchs anymore.
Yeah.
I'm taking the Spanish throne. I'm paraphrasing ever so slightly in case people are wondering.
And like you were saying before, it doesn't quite make sense, does it? I mean, usually when you do something like that, you pick the heir, you make him your puppet, and you send him back.
Exactly.
But Napoleon decides, no, I just want all the Bourbons gone because I hate you all, you know. And he says, well, for a start, I know Murat wants to be king of Spain. He wants to be king of somewhere. He's a start. There was a brief idea of marrying, I think, Lucien's daughter to Fernando, and that didn't work out because Lucien said no. And because he was a sensible man until I believe told one of the people who told Napoleon don't mess around in Spain. And then of course you have his other brother, quite a capable brother who is doing fairly good work in Naples at the second, is Joseph. And for some reason, Napoleon decides I'm going to choose one of my family to replace the Bourbons on the throne of Spain.
Doesn't he offer it to Louis? And
He
Louis
might
says
have.
no.
I think there was some discussion about who it was going to be. I don't remember exactly how many people he asked.
Yeah. I mean, so to give people a sense of dates, we're now up to May, specifically the 5th of May, where they're told, look, it's all over. Thanks very much. I'm having your crown and I'm going to redistribute it as I see fit. Meanwhile, in Paris, there's a little thing called El Dos y Tres de Mayo.
Madrid.
Sorry.
I usually let these things go. You can edit that.
You know what? We'll leave it in. I mean, here I am professing to be an expert in the Peninsular War.
No, I've done it
And
before. It's a capital city, and you get the wires crossed in your head, and we were talking about the French a second ago. It happens to me all the time. It's really annoying, and you never catch it because you think you've said the right word.
so Josh is being incredibly nice, which is even more reason to leave this in because it will make people love Josh that bit more. Meanwhile, in a place called Madrid, which I do happen to know is the capital of some European country, maybe Spain, probably. You got the Dos de Mayo uprising, which is uh, uh, that noise that just escaped my mouth is a really good kind of, erudite summing up of how this is handled. This is why I look at Murat and just go, I'm sorry. Yes, you can star an ostrich feather in your uniform, but you are clearly not the sharpest tool in the shed by a country mile. Because what you have here is that discontent has been brewing over uncertainty with the Spanish monarchy and France, and particularly French refusal to recognize Ferdinand. And that's something that we need to kind of say that the French aren't giving any outward signs that they're going to be particularly supportive of just the natural progression of interior affairs in their ally. And the crowd's picking up on that. And then this crowd gathers at the Royal Palace, and I've got Paris on the flaming mind now. And there's concern that the rest of the royal family is basically being packed up to be shipped off to France. There's this genuine fear about kidnap. And so the crowd get out of hand. There is blood. They attack Murat's ADC. I suspect the fact that it's Murat's ADC might be part of the problem here. And Murat's response is to clear the streets with the Imperial Guard. So, strong-willed response. You can kind of see where he's going with this. And 10 Spanish are killed or wounded in the process, which then gets Spanish blood up. And they respond by killing the admittedly very few Frenchmen that they can find. And then the rebels are quickly crushed. So you end up with this situation where you've got 200 Spanish dead, 200 Spanish wounded, 300 Spaniards taken prisoner, to a French loss of 31 dead and 114 wounded. And Murat decides that the best way to deal with this is brutal reprisal. And I'm going to quote directly from his decree, which says, "The population of Madrid, led astray, has given itself to revolt and murder. French blood has flowed. It demands vengeance. All those arrested in the uprising, arms in hand, will be shot." And then he follows through with it. These aren't idle words. Perhaps it's not surprising for Murat, who does love to follow through. I mean, cavalryman, he's got that kind of go at them mentality. But, it's a propaganda godsend, right? For the Spanish, you have the Tres de Mayo, the executions the following day, subsequently immortalized by Goya. And what you effectively do is take this little kind of flare up of discontent and suddenly you kick it everywhere, right across Spain, as fast as people can ride, because you've got what Napoleon, and you've got this sucker punch happening in rapid succession, right? You've got Dos de Mayo, then Tres de Mayo, then Cinco de Mayo, frankly, with what happens with the relinquishing of the Ferdinand and Carlos relinquishing claim to the throne. So within the space of a handful of days, you've got 3 massively insulting events taking place, deeply, deeply stoking any kind of discontent that might have been felt across different social classes, and suddenly concentrating it all on the French, because whatever your internal situation may be, and however much you might hate, and that's something to emphasize, that all the way through the Peninsular War, the Spanish are fighting amongst each other, whether it's in the army, whether it's in Parliament that gets formed subsequently, the Cortes. But because you've got the French doing this, deciding that they're going to run your internal affairs, deciding who your monarch is, brutally repressing any expression of discontent, it just concentrates the mind entirely on the French as the people that are the problem here.
Yes, absolutely. And, Dos de Mayo is not an organized thing. It wasn't planned. It was chaos. The fact that it did so much damage is frankly surprising. Usually riots like that, you see 5 or 10 soldiers get killed before it's very quickly sort of subdued. But no, this goes completely out of control, and you have hundreds of people getting killed and then massive reprisals afterwards. It's it's a very troubling thing, and arguably it can be said therefore that Murat mishandled it by by the decisions he made. And yeah, the it, it's so surprising even to this day to try and track how it got out of control. But because none of the French really seem to understand, the forces at play, they sort of just, again, they're wandering into an arsenal with a lit match, and it's just gone off. Now, it's very key here that Spain no longer has a government. And as you were saying, infighting is big as well, because that whole thing about please Napoleon mediate between Carlos IV and Fernando, and he's that was a consequence of the fact that the prince's party had technically won. They had unseated Godoy, the Queen's man, and was in a position now to try and wrest the throne from his father. What he wanted Napoleon to do was to give him the throne. His party in Madrid still thought that the French had the answers, and I believe a lot of them ended up turning to Joseph's faction. And the fact is, though, now nobody has a leader, so they have to do this by local juntas, and that's what happens. You get provincial governments popping up across the country, each one basically declaring martial law to whatever extent they can, and usually arbitrarily picking one of the two candidates on the throne or to the throne, until everybody kind of decides, well, it probably should be Fernando, and they all start fighting for him. But it's a massive deal. It's a massive piece of chaos, because this word has to get across the sea as well to the Spanish colonies, and all hell breaks loose once it gets over there, which is a whole different thing.
That is a whole different thing. And we have an episode on Simon Bolivar incoming at some point with, surprise, surprise, Josh, because he's the expert on these things. You make a good point there, which is that the French aren't ready for this. They've got 90,000 troops in Spain. They're mainly in the north, apart from those that are in Madrid, for obvious reasons. It's the capital. And it's a measure of that. If you were anticipating some kind of result like this, you would have a better distribution of your forces. That's the bottom line, right?
You'd have disarmed the army. You'd have like taken away their ability to fight for a start. A well-planned coup requires you to get a hold of the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, or at least two of the three. And the French have one of the three.
It's worth saying a couple of things, though. First is that at this point, a lot of British listeners love to make a jump and go, okay, so now you've got the guerrillas happening, which isn't the case. This is where you kind of bring in the Charles Esdale kind of line, which is, well, first things to say is that not everybody who's a guerrilla is actually a Spanish patriot taking part in the guerrilla, the little war. Actually, what you've got is significant groups of brigands and other just deplorable types in society who go, look, here's an opportunity to either kick somebody's head in or steal stuff or otherwise, wreak havoc. And so you get a lot of just outlaw bands that like to style them / get mistaken as guerrillas. You've also got the point that at this moment in time, we're still not in a position where the entire country is up in arms. And in fairness, you've got the Francesados movement as well, the Francophile individuals. So it's not as though every single person in Spain just suddenly turns around and goes, oh, the French are evil, let's all pick up a hatchet and have at them. So that takes time, and it takes time for these bands to form. You've also got situations with the army that end up feeding the guerrilla groups, both, brigand and actual organized bands. And I'm sure we'll end up talking in a lot more detail about the guerrillas in due course. The British at this point, they're still not quite interested. That's there's not this kind of meerkat popping its head up moment yet,
Nope.
because for that we need Bailen, right?
Yes, we do. I think that is definitely the case. I don't know the timeline off by heart. As dos and tres de Mayo signal basically the formation of the juntas, and I think that you get after that missions. That there's definitely a mission sent out, I think, before Bailen. But they don't really drum up much support, I think. The British are aware of the rising, especially as it spreads across the border to Portugal. But they're still not really thinking, they're a little bit more interested, I guess, but still, can we really do anything at all? Is it going to be beneficial to us? Because that's the important thing. Is there something actionable we can do to further the war in our favor? And at the second, everything's in chaos, and the British really hate getting involved in things that are chaotic. First of all, who is in charge? Who are we speaking with? Is the junta of Andalusia going to agree with the junta of Galicia? It's
And the perfect example of precisely that is, of course, when Wellesley pitches up
yeah.
off the coast of Spain. And I think he's at Coruña, isn't he? And he sends a message to the shore saying to the junta in Galicia, look, I'm here. I've got an army coming. Do you want me to land and help you out? And the Galicians go, no. Oh, but we'll take some weapons. If you've got some
Yeah.
weapons going, if you've got any money as well, we'll have some money. And so Wellesley wisely decides that his cause is better served further down the coast, which is why he ends up heading for Portugal.
Yeah.
But
it should also be remembered that at the time that the Spanish were starting to think, the Spanish juntas were looking around for allies, and a very brave decision to ask the British. In London at that time, you had people like Francisco de Miranda, who is the Venezuelan freedom fighter, who at the second is gleefully planning a descent on Spanish America with a British force. So the British are still at this time much more interested in disrupting Spain's economy through its colonies than trying to liberate it from the French.
timing is absolutely everything here, right? And again, so to put folks into a sense of perspective, you got the Dos and Tres de Mayo, so 2nd and 3rd of May. That's where the name comes from for those who don't speak Spanish. And it's not until July that you get Bailen. And the idea of Bailen is that it's a game changer. I remember a long time ago, nearly 3 years ago now, speaking to Alithia Laspera, and she, for a podcast episode, and she said that Bailen was basically a dream. It was one of those situations never to be repeated again. You could wargame that situation 1,000 times and not get the outcome that you got.
It's fascinating and massively understudied. Its name, you kind of know it as the simple trigger, but you don't really know what's happening or what's happening or fitting it into the wider early stages of the Peninsular War. Everything about that was a dream, right? From Dos y Tres de Mayo, and then to the sieges of the barrier cities, and then by Bailen. None of that should have happened. The scale of the French defeat, and it was defeat in 1808 by the Spanish, who had no fixed central government, no way of paying its troops, is utter insanity. And Napoleon couldn't get his head around it either. But Napoleon made his bed because it was his orders that dictated strategy after Murat left Madrid. And I think it was I've forgotten his name who replaced him, but it's the Bailen happens because of several factors, in my opinion. The first is Napoleon's overarching strategic sort of directions to his commanders in Spain. Inside that is a, to be honest, reasonable underestimation of the Spanish armed capability in comparison to the French. And that's the main one. Once you get past that, you get the flying columns. This is Napoleon's decent idea to send strong 20,000 man, 13,000 man columns into various parts of Spain, target the provincial cities, take them, and then we'll clear up all this insurgency. And the armies, of course, the Spanish can't fight. I mean, who cares about them? You'll just deal with them. And that was literally his attitude to his commanders. He just basically wrote stuff like, and if he suffers a small reverse, he'll just have to retreat a little bit and it'll be fine. And then you have, and so there's that, and then there's Dupont, who is in charge of the army at Bailen. And his mistakes just compound the errors Napoleon makes while he's massing troops on the border through 1808. And his mistakes are roughly one, some of them are out of his control. For a start, he doesn't have terribly good troops. They're supposed to be garrison troops and internal security troops and things, and he only gets a small reinforcement of capable troops like his Swiss soldiers who bear the brunt of the fighting at Bailen. But he makes interesting decisions, such as sacking and looting Cordoba, which one doctor, I believe, said added the baggage of 150,000 men to the army and slowed it down ridiculously. Other things out of his control was by the time he was about to get into Andalusia, which is another problem, because Napoleon's orders get worse the further you are away from Napoleon. And he is really far away from Napoleon. Also, Andalusia is a very, very proud Spanish. It's a heartland of Spain. It's not going to go without a fight. But he is, he's unaware that no more help is going to come to him because the French are getting, well, they're getting beaten around the face at Zaragoza, Girona, and Verona. I think those are the big three. And they're being repulsed from these cities. He doesn't know that, and he's just blithely moving on. And meanwhile, you get this regular Spanish officer by the name of Castaños. And he's watching this, and he's thinking, that's interesting.
There are moments when I wish that this wasn't exclusively a radio show, because some of the facial expressions that Josh pulled there were truly delightful. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, Dupont's reputation is shot to smithereens by the end of this, on a par with sort of Marmont's reputation now. Napoleon's fuming. You can't use polite words to describe Napoleon's level of anger about this. I mean,
and honestly, I don't blame him either. Give them the stats.
Yeah, it's entirely fair. So, 1st of July, 1808, Battle of Bailen. What effectively happens is that Dupont ends up being caught, strung out on a march, whilst carrying wounded, understandable, but not the purpose of a flying column, and whilst carrying his loot, which really isn't the purpose of a flying column, because a flying column, as the name suggests, needs to move fast, hit hard, and keep moving. It needs to do sort of what Juno was endeavouring to do in terms of trying to reach Lisbon before the Portuguese royal family upsticks and sailed away. That's the kind of focus that's required here. And the French forces end up being split. when they're attacked, the counterattacks go in a piecemeal fashion. They get nowhere. They take 2,000 casualties. Battalions sort of rock up, and instantly Dupont is throwing them into the fighting line to try and fight fires and plug gaps. He's got virtually no control over the situation. He knows that he's beaten, and so he negotiates. That's kind of sensible. But then he goes and surrenders 17,000 men. 17,000. Now, they were supposed to be repatriated. That was meant to be part of the deal, and the Spanish didn't honor that. Instead, they're transported to the island of Carbera, I think it is, where many of them end up dying of starvation. That's a particularly horrific story in and of itself. I can't quote this off the top of my head, but I suspect that cannibalism ended up setting in at one point. Napoleon turns around and he basically says that Dupont's surrendered his honor and the honor of France in return for protecting his baggage.
Yeah.
That's the level of utter fury, because you've got to think about how this looks. This is a French commander of a French force deep in the heart of hostile territory that suffers, sure, 2,000 casualties, but still has 17,000 men to, in theory, take the field.
In quotes, the best troops in Europe. I mean, they weren't actually the best of the best, but it's still the French army, and
And nobody's
probably
going to acknowledge that, right?
yeah.
Nobody's going to go, oh well, look, okay, this wasn't even the B team,
Nobody
this was the C
cares.
team. It's the Spanish did what to 17,000 French troops? You take them all prisoner. And that's the kind of electrifying shockwave style effect. This is the point at which the British suddenly turn into meerkats and go, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
Now we're interested, because suddenly they think that the Spanish are this force to be reckoned with that nobody had factored into the fight.
Mhm.
Suddenly you've got a Spanish army able to humiliate a French force. And in the process, they think, well, okay, this is fantastic. The Spanish can do the heavy lifting. We'll pay, which is what, by the way, we're good at. We can pay these people. We can arm them. We can do all of the stuff that we've done for these other coalitions. We'll send some troops as well, because we're quite good at that. We've got a force conveniently located and assembling in Ireland under some little-known guy called Arthur Wellesley. As you said earlier, did quite well in India, shows a bit of promise. Admittedly, he was with orders to go and take the war to the Spanish in their colonies, but we'll forget that. We'll put that to one side. It's the my enemy's enemy is my friend situation, and there is very much this sense that it's not going to take much to completely change the dynamic here. There is this sense of, well, look, we get them over there. We perhaps help them with a bit of mopping up operations, and then who knows what could happen. Give these Spaniards time to arm and refit and all the rest of it, and perhaps they can be invading France before we know it. That's the level of how far you could easily get carried away with these kinds of ideas.
This is the scale of that battle. It went across Europe. It encouraged the Austrians to get back in the game, and it wasn't just Bailen, because, like I say, there's the three unsuccessful sieges that the French, especially after Bailen, basically say, oh, okay, we need to back off here. And by the end of the summer, they have evacuated Madrid. They are sitting on the other side of the Ebro, and the Spanish have actually thrown the French out of the central Spain, which is just mind-boggling to most people.
60,000 French troops told where to go. The fact that Napoleon comes south and takes personal command for a winter campaign, 1808 to 9, tells you everything you need to know about his appreciation of the fact this cannot wait. This needs to be dealt with right now, because this is a humiliating embarrassment for me, and I need to absolutely hammer my authority on this part of the world, because it is not looking good.
No, this is the first. I believe it is the first defeat of a French imperial army in the wars, like proper utter total defeat.
So we have a situation where we will probably talk more, I suspect, about the sieges in another episode, because we kind of need to get to the withdrawal behind the Ebro, but also talk about what happens in Portugal, which is another thing to point out, right?
Yes.
That poor old Juno, inverted commas, poor old Juno, he has managed to fill his pockets with everything that the Portuguese royal family didn't manage to take with them. Um, he's now effectively marooned
Yeah.
uh, in Portugal. No hope of reinforcements. Having to supply himself from the interior, and the Portuguese aren't sitting idly by
No,
twiddling their thumbs whilst they're looking at what
Portuguese, yeah, the
happens.
Portuguese see what the Spanish are doing and say, well, let's do the same, guys. And
We'll have a piece of that.
Lisbon is all Juno has.
So you've got Juno kind of almost besieged within his own country in Lisbon. You've got the Spanish just basically telling the French where to go. You've got this electrifying effect of the romance of it as well. Let's
Mm.
be honest. There's heavy romanticism about this. This captures the imagination of the British population, which I think is also really beneficial. You get that very strong sense that for those who are reading the papers or listening to the papers, because they're read in coffee houses, they're read in public places, verbally to those who aren't literate, you get this perception that every single Spaniard has taken up arms against the
Yes.
French and give them a kick between the legs. And it's that suddenly there's this, the good old rugged Spaniard ends up finding their way into the caricatures. You've got depictions of nuns taking up knives and
Mm.
going after the French troops. You've got some brilliant caricatures by Gilray. I'm trying to think of the names off the top of my head, and they're escaping me. But just spectacular ones of Spanish patriots attacking the French banditti. Royal
Mm.
Britain's lending a lift is the big one. There we go. I found the name in the end, and this is very kind of almost frankly 16th century depictions of Spaniards like
Yeah.
loading cannons, and as I say, nuns and all the rest of it. Very much this kind of sense of everybody up in arms against the French here. And then you've got sort of this solitary British grenadier sort of standing there in a rugged kind of outlook, thrusting his bayonets pointedly at Frenchmen and all the rest of it. And you kind of get this sense of suddenly the Brits are interested in going and helping this cause of liberty. You've got other caricatures which really point to this idea that we'll shower gold and guns on these people, and give them some guidance. We'll show them the way because we're British, and
Yes.
all of the arrogance that comes with that. But the net reaction is that when Spain goes, we want money, they go, okay, we can give you some money, but by the way, we've got an army ready to go. And thus we reach the start of British involvement in the Peninsular War.
Mm. Yes, definitely. And it's very ironic / tragic / comedic that the British swallow whole this whole what has just happened in the summer of 1808, and basically they're too late to take advantage of it, is the problem. Now, there's no way they could have actually taken advantage of it, because there was no way of predicting that this would happen. Riots happen in capitals all the time. Even you hear about Dos de Mayo, sure, all right, that they don't like the French. Nobody likes the French. We sympathize, but I'm not going to invest my money here just because somebody is upset about it all. the news of the sieges of, you know, the news of the repulse of the French from the cities and Bailen, and the news of the retreat to the Ebro gives the impression to the British that they all they need to do is support, send one army, send enough money, get the fleet involved, and we can just all march happily into the Pyrenees. Unfortunately, as you said, Napoleon correctly identifies that a speedy response is necessary before the year is out. And he's just in the nick of time, actually, by doing that. The British are slower, and it's going to be a bruising experience that will nevertheless ensure continued British involvement in the peninsula, because they are going into something, a situation that by the time they get there no longer exists.
Yeah, it's not quite that people are turning around and saying this will all be over by Christmas, but equally, there is not this anticipation that this is a war that's going to rumble on for another 6 years. Nobody is thinking that in 1808, and you can see that in the opposition that springs up in Parliament as the war rumbles on and doesn't have an obvious conclusion in sight, a la 1809 to 10 to 11. I think the big thing to take away is the staggering propaganda coup slash failure for Napoleon that happens in the summer of 1808. Whichever way you look at it, it's a godsend if you want to stoke discontent against the guy. And as the master of propaganda, he looks at that and knows that he screwed it up. I think one of the things that also comes across very strongly from what we've said is a lack of strategic understanding by both sides. And by both sides here, I'm actually referring to the British government and Napoleon in Paris, in terms of what reality looks like on the ground in Spain. And that distant attempt to assess and manage is fundamentally part of the problem. And that's not to say that the Brits don't send diplomats to the region to try and test the water. We've got some
more Welsleys show up.
Exactly. There's an abundance of the guys at this moment in time. But yeah, it's everything that a fairy tale is made of on paper. And
it's a founding myth of modern Spain as well.
It is as simple as that. And I think that's probably a good note on which to hit the pause button on this rundown of the history of the peninsula. Josh, as ever, it's an absolute joy, folks. Bullocks, grain, and good Madeira on the Murat and Jack campaigns. Go buy ye. It's available at hellion.co.uk. We'll be back probably quite soon. But in the meantime, you can look forward to an episode incoming with Josh on Simon Bolivar. But Josh, until then, great to see you, my friend, and I'll look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Absolutely. Great episode, and happy you asked me to come and do the Peninsular War.
Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.